Welcome back, everyone. We hope you were able to network and make some connections with other attendees. Our next session is a fireside chat with our distinguished guest, the 29th Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull. We're looking forward to his conversation with EEI Vice President for International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones, which will center around catalyzing climate solutions. Without further ado, please welcome Honourable Turnbull and Lawrence to the stage.
Good morning, Malcolm. Welcome to EEI Global Electrification Forum.
Hey, thank you very much, Lawrence. Great to be with you.
Excellent. Well, look, we're going to start. We got a lot to cover, and we got 30 minutes. I want to jump straight in the book to start with the book. This is a very well-written book, I would say, with a lot of interesting things. The book title is A Bigger Picture. Why this title, and why do you go to such lengths in being so precise in who did what, said what in the book?
Well, the title is really what the book is all about, approaching politics, policy, life, I guess, with a big picture in mind. You've got to have a vision, you've got to know where you're going, you've got to have a plan. And that's what the book's about. As for the detail, there's no substitute for getting the facts right, Lawrence. I'm an old lawyer, and I'm very, I'm precise. I try very hard to get the facts straight. Obviously, sometimes it's hard to be as precise as you'd like to be, but it is. Nobody's accused me of making lots of factual errors there.
Excellent. So I'm going to actually just jump straight to the chapter that is the topic of this conversation, Malcolm, which is chapter 46 in the book. Talks about climate denial, and it talks about national energy guarantee. And there's an interesting paragraph I'm going to read from the book where you said on page 597, which I'm sure you remember, you said, I was confident we could reach the trifecta of low emissions, affordability, and reliability with renewables plus storage. And then you go on to say, however, you needed to have a plan. What happened to that plan? What happened?
Well, essentially, I had enormous political opposition, mostly from within my own party. But there is in Australia, as there is in the United States, there has been this toxic coalition of right-wing politics, right-wing media, much of it owned by Rupert Murdoch, and of course the fossil fuel lobby. And what they have done is, in a process of denialism, they've denied the reality of global warming in order to, for reasons I don't entirely understand, turn the physics of global warming and the imperative to address it into an issue of identity or belief. And truthfully, saying you believe or disbelieve in global warming is about as sensible as saying you believe or disbelieve in gravity. It actually doesn't matter what you think about gravity, it applies to you.
Well, so that's
the case with global warming, by the way. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very important point you make. And in spite of all of the severe extreme weather we've seen in Australia, the bushfires, the flooding, there are still people who believe that it's not real.
Yeah, there is. It's this process, and you see it in the United States too. I mean, the parallels are very close. Where you get people, where in the many parts of the Republican Party, perhaps most of the Republican Party, taking climate change seriously is a heresy. Now, the frustrating thing is we have to replace ideology and idiocy with engineering and economics. I mean, we can have cheaper, hence affordable, reliable, and zero-emission electricity. With the technologies we have today. We don't have to invent something new. And I'm not suggesting there won't be, more efficient photovoltaic modules and, more efficient batteries and so forth. But the reality is we have the means to do it right now. And in fact, what is holding us up, I believe, in the US and in Australia has been politics. It's not, when I was John Howard's Environment Minister back in 2007, the big issue was how much are we prepared to pay extra to cut our emissions. Now we can move to zero emission electricity and have cheaper electricity, and by electrifying our economy, our industry, we can obviously reduce emissions in sectors that are, currently powered by liquid fuels, like transport, for example. Electric vehicles powered by renewable energy addresses, the emissions reduction objectives very effectively. I'm sorry, Lawrence. You're on mute. You're on mute.
I said the good thing we have now. I think the world is sort of feeling a new momentum. There's a new re-engagement of the United States. A lot of people are talking about it, and you talk about investments. And so as we go tomorrow, there's going to be the climate summit in Washington, D.C. President Biden. One of the guests is the Australian Prime Minister, Mr. Morris. And I think it was said today that the government has committed $540 million for hydrogen, and for also for, I believe, investing in carbon capture and utilization. Is that enough? Is 539 million enough, or do we?
Well, look, it's a tiny amount, particularly over 10 years. There is no substitute for having, as we should have, a very clear target to cut our emissions by a very substantial amount by 2030, and indeed to get to net zero well before 2050. Now, we do have the means to do that, but it does require planning. Now, just to give your listeners and viewers an indication of what I'm talking about. When I was Prime Minister, looking at the this phenomenon of variable renewable energy coming into the grid at increasing rates, the impact it was having on continuous thermal generation, I recognised that what we would need to do is provide for and build long duration storage. And so I got underway what is being constructed now, Snowy Hydro 2.0, which is the largest pumped hydro scheme in the Southern Hemisphere. Will initially, in its first stage, be 2,000 megawatt scheme, and it can be expanded because the two linked reservoirs are large, to 8,000 megawatts. Now, what we need, we've got to recognise that our grid is changing. It's going from centralised continuous thermal generation to distributed variable generation. So we need much more flexibility. We need much more. We need storage. We need the capabilities, with batteries, synchronous condensers, and other techniques to maintain frequency. All of those FCAS, and other ancillary services. So it is a really exciting world. There's never been a more exciting time to be in the energy business than today, because the technology, the topography, all of it is changing so rapidly, but you have to plan for it. And so this is where politics gets in the way, where you get politicians who want to continue imagining that the world's going to keep on going the way it is. We're just going to keep on burning coal forever. It's not going to happen. And if we don't recognise those changes and plan for them, then we'll end up losing. It's the difference between, if you're a surfer, it's the difference between catching a wave and having it dump all over you.
I like that analogy. So I want to move on now and talk about the momentum we see in the world today around climate. Obviously, the meeting tomorrow that President Biden is hosting is a big deal. A lot of non-binding pledges that we see coming from different countries, corporations. How important are those pledges, and how do we make sure to catalyze the necessary change, that those pledges move from pledges to actual projects and actual reality? How do we do that? How do we catalyze action instead of pledges, or besides pledges?
Well, as you know, a vision without a resourced plan is a hallucination. Okay, so you've got it. The pledge has got to be backed with a plan, and that every jurisdiction will have perhaps a somewhat different plan. But the good thing is it's doable. If the reality is, Lawrence, if you and I were asked tomorrow to provide 500 megawatts of continuous base load, I guess you'd describe it, energy in Australia, we would not build a gas-fired power station, a coal-fired power station. We would do a combination of variable renewable energy and storage, right? There's no question about it. We do that regardless of what your views were on carbon costs or climate change and so forth. So we actually have the better mousetrap has arrived. And what we've got to do is plan for it. So you can't have, for example, big thermal generation switching off suddenly without putting something in its place. There's got to be planning. I mean, we have in Australia the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, which many of you would be familiar with, and until recently we had an outstanding American woman, Audrey Ziebelman, running it, and it's work. Some of its integrated system plan and all of its other publications are really an example of the type of long-range planning that you need. So we know what we need to do, but we just need to get around the politics of it. And I mean, again, you see it in the United States. I mean, you have people denying the reality of global warming there on the right of politics, just like there were people denying the reality of COVID, and what a price America paid for that.
Well, that's interesting. So you mentioned planning a number of times. You talked about AMO. Obviously, you have the Australian NEM. But, Malcolm, one interesting project in Australia has caught my attention is the idea of building this transmission line from Australia to Singapore. What's your view on that? I mean, is it feasible? Is this something that's worth investing in?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely feasible. The long distance, high voltage direct current transmission is absolutely, yes, it's definitely doable technically. I think that there, and there's no question you can generate an enormous amount of low cost renewable energy in Northern Australia, where the radiation is asset or capabilities are just so high. Okay, so that's all good. The question mark I would have over it is simply the reliability of the cable. It's a very geologically active part of the world, going through from Australia through the Indonesian archipelago up to Singapore. It's not called the Ring of Fire for nothing, and subsea cables do break, so I think there's a security aspect there. A lot of people believe, and Andrew Forrest, the founder of Fortescue Metals Group, the big iron ore company, he is a real visionary in this area of green hydrogen and green ammonia, and I'm helping him with that. But I think one opportunity, another way of exporting green energy from Australia, renewable energy, is to make green hydrogen and green ammonia and then ship that, as opposed to shipping the electrons through a cable. But look, Lawrence, the bottom line is you've got to try everything. There's no point, if you just sort of spin round and round in a circle of sort of skeptical, cynicism, you won't get anything done. So I look forward to some of these long distance subsea cables being built. That is a very long one, and as I said, there are security implications for it. You would need to have a lot of redundancy, and of course that adds to the cost. So
yeah. Well, so Malcolm, as you all know, I spent a lot of time in Australia and really region. One of the things I'm intrigued about is this whole idea on carbon tax or carbon trading, right? So Europeans have an effective one. Australia seems to have an opposition to it one way or the other. Now, given your experience as a former prime minister, what kind of policies do you think countries like Australia should enact to be able to sort of effectively reduce emissions, if from a pricing perspective?
Well, I don't think any economist would argue with you that the most efficient way to do it is to have an economy-wide price on carbon, right? Having said that, carbon trading schemes, emissions trading schemes, have tended to work better in theory than in practice around the world. So, I just make that note, that sort of footnote to it. Secondly, it became incredibly politicised in Australia, and I don't think either side of politics would go near an emissions trading scheme. Just it was that sort of right wing, troika of fossil fuels, right wing media, mostly Murdoch, right wing politics, so demonised an emissions trading scheme that I don't think it could be revived, even though it was actually the policy of John Howard's Conservative government, in which I was the Environment Minister in 2007. But again, it's all in the book. If you're interested,
it is in the book. A bigger picture.
But you see, the good news is that we can actually have our cake and eat it too. In other words, we can have zero emissions energy and cheaper energy. And that's now that if I'd said that 10 years ago, you would have thought I was just, crazy. But it is, the cost per watt, as again, this audience will know better than me, of PV has come down by over 90% in the last decade, so and there's a long way further to go. So we've got a lot of progress to be had in PV and solar generation, and indeed in storage, chemical storage. Now, I am a fan of pumped hydro. It's been around for over 100 years. It's a pretty mature technology, but the thing is that most of the world's stored electricity is stored in pumped hydro schemes, and it is one way we know we can provide for long duration storage. So again, there's been some terrific work done here in Australia, Lawrence, by which my government funded, in fact, by the ANU and a man called Andrew Blakers on off-river pumped hydro. Because hydro has got a bit of a, people are concerned about building dams, rightly. There are environmental issues. It's got to be done sustainably and so forth. But the truth is that to have a pumped hydro storage system, you just need two connected reservoirs at a sufficiently different elevation. And so they don't have to be on a river. One reservoir could be at the bottom of an old mine. Another one could be a Turkey's Nest Dam at the top. Again, there are projects like that underway. I think my message to governments, and this is why I'm working on a commission with your Department of Energy in the US on this issue, is we've got to get cracking, because we can build a solar farm in months, we can build a wind farm in a year or more, but to build pumped storage, because it involves earthworks, water, permitting, a lot of civil construction, that can take quite a few years. So Snowy 2, I announced that in 2017, right? It will be operating in 2025. So that's 8 years, and that has been at a cracking pace. So, that's the point. So that asymmetry in terms of timing between the time to create the variable renewable generation and the time to create the long duration storage, that means you've got to plan ahead.
Yeah, what's interesting, planning ahead, a big country, Australia, and I want to compare with Norway, a smaller country. In terms of electric vehicles, we know that Norway is moving at a very fast pace, but apparently in Australia, it seems to have taken much slower pace. What's the reason behind that? Why is it going so slow in Australia?
Well, there's no subsidy for electric vehicles for reasons that were almost, it's what I'm going to tell you, you'll think I've made up, but at the last election in 2019, I was out of politics by this stage, so I wasn't involved in it. The Labor Party, the centre-left party, had a electric vehicle, subsidy scheme. Not very extravagant. It was just designed to promote electric vehicles. The government, Mr. Morrison's government, decided to demonise that and launched into this full-blown tabloid attack on electric vehicles. Said it would destroy the weekend because people would get in the electric vehicle with the kids, and their battery had run out halfway there. And it was almost it was almost the stuff of a satire, of something you might see on Saturday Night Live, but it was run and it was, again, backed up by the Murdoch media. And so electric vehicles were demonized. It was seriously crazy. So they're kind of crab walking back from that. But, electric vehicles really are so important for us. A couple of reasons. Fuel security, because, we don't have we import almost all of our liquid fuels. So that's a very important thing. Fuel security, obviously reducing emissions. And of course, in Australia, we produce the minerals that batteries are made of. We are, one of the world's biggest, if not the biggest producer of lithium, obviously nickel, cadmium, cobalt, all of those metals and rare earths are to be found in Australia. And of course, with the tensions between the US and China in particular, having an Australian source of some of those vital materials is more important than ever.
Yeah, that's a very interesting segue into the whole notion of geopolitics of the energy transition, what we see happening there. I must say, though, as a small country, you do a very good job in getting some very interesting ideas out. I must, comment, one of your leading people in the utility sector, who's a good friend of mine, Ian McLeod, has always said very interesting thing. He used to be the CEO of Ergon Energy, and he's had some very interesting views on some of the policies and some of the sort of regulatory issues going on in Australia compared to the rest of the world. And in that context, I want to quickly just talk about the fact that you can build renewables very quickly in Australia. But when it comes to building transmission and other kinds of infrastructure, it seems to take a long time. What needs to happen to accelerate the building of transmission and other infrastructure to enable the renewable energy that we need?
Well, there are a couple of things. Obviously, the regulatory regime, which is elaborate, which is obviously designed theoretically to prevent the construction of unnecessary or gold-plated infrastructure, the cost of which will be thrown onto consumers. But that system has been and can be gamed by incumbents to obstruct competition. So there are regulatory problems. When I was PM, I changed some of those rules, if you like, by abolishing the limited merits reviews. But again, that's fairly technical stuff. I think also, Lawrence, in any country where you're building new transmission, you're going to have objections. There are land use issues. You have them in the US. This is one of the reasons why you've got to be smart about reusing transmission and transmission corridors. So if you have an area such as you have in New South Wales and the Hunter Valley, where has been historically and still is a lot of coal-fired generation, and hence a lot of transmission infrastructure going into that area, as the coal-fired generation is closed, you've got to be making sure that you're putting in new solar generation, pump storage, and there's projects underway to do that, but we need a lot more of that so that as the old generation goes out, the new clean generation comes in and we can reuse those transmission lines. Because it may not be the ideal site. It may not be as good a site as a solar farm out in Western New South Wales or Western Queensland, because the radiation isn't as good, but you've got to offset that against the fact that your transmission is already built.
And I want to talk then in this context about digitalization. I mean, one of the things Australian utilities have done very well, you have Endeavour, you have Gemini, a lot of these utilities, they're using digital technology. I've discussed this many times with Ian McLeod, again, on this issue of digitalization. So, Malcolm, what's your view on the importance of digitalization in the context of the energy transition?
Well, it's absolutely critical. And, you're seeing this everywhere. I mean, the demand management, digitization is critical to demand management. We're moving from a grid where we had a relatively small number of big continuous thermal generators centralized to one where generation, even at an industrial level, is very distributed. But of course, in Australia, you've got, I think it's now about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 rooftops, domestic rooftops, have got solar power plants on them. So, and many people have now got household batteries. There are moves to build neighbourhood batteries. I see the Labor Party has a policy to do that. I think that will probably get emulated by the government at some point. You can see that you've just got to sort of unpack your brain from all of the preconceptions of the past and look at the grid in its modern incarnation, which is got to be flexible, distributed. It's got to be so much more responsive. And remember, in terms of demand management, that can be very dynamic. And there are Australian energy companies, as you know, that have been trialling, demand management schemes with, domestic customers as well as industrial customers. It's one thing to say to a big, aluminium smelter, back off for 5 minutes and, to take some pressure off the grid. But if you are in a position to, control when people's air conditioning goes on, have air conditioning goes on, during the day, when people are at work, you run the air conditioners, cool the house down, when there's lots of free, very cheap solar energy. And then when demand peaks and, the renewables decline because the sun's gone down, you can back off that air conditioning because people are coming home to a cool house. I mean, there's a lot of smart things we can do once once we're in command in the way that, digital capabilities enable us to be. So yes, it's absolutely critical.
One other question, then we'll get to the final round here of some very quick questions with some quick answers. But I just want to talk about artificial intelligence. Wildfires, or bushfires, as you call it in Australia, flooding. Again, you have Endeavour doing some good work. You have Gemini. You have a lot of companies in Australia. What do you think the significance of artificial intelligence is, quickly, and what are some of the risks of artificial intelligence?
Well, it depends what you mean. If you're talking about machine learning, it's obviously enormously important in every area. I think it's I don't think I can answer that adequately quickly, Lawrence, other than to say it's enormously important. But a lot of what people call artificial intelligence is just machine learning, and there's a big difference.
Okay, I'll have my friends at Monash University figure out how to give a crisp, concise explanation of artificial intelligence. But let me just wrap up with 2 questions, and I think you can answer these relatively quickly. First of all, what concerns you about the way forward, and what excites you about the way forward?
Well, what concerns me is that we're not planning enough and thinking that we're not taking into account the big picture enough, and we're not planning enough and thinking forward. We need more planning, like Snowy 2.0, where you're actually, looking over the horizon and, planning and preparing for the future. What excites me is that we've got the capabilities of moving to zero emissions. I mean, there literally are no technological challenges to that. It's all execution now. We have the technologies to do it. So, and those technologies are only going to improve.
So would you say then, Malcolm, that we are on an irreversible trajectory to a net zero world?
Oh, well, yes. Well, we are. I mean, well, I wouldn't say it's irreversible, because humans are capable of enormous stupidity, both individually and collectively. But the fact is, yes, we need to be. But can I just say to you, history is littered with inevitable causes that never happened, that were never realised. So, you've got to make it happen. But we have the means to do it. It's not like we are saying, as Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon, when they had no way of knowing how they were going to do that. We can actually have a zero emission energy world. We can do that, and we can have cheaper and more abundant electricity and more equitable electricity. So we actually can do it. The means are here now, and those means are only going to get better over time. So we just have to get cracking with it.
Last and final question, Malcolm. Really have enjoyed this conversation, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question. Being a man, a family man, you got, I guess, 4 grandchildren. What do you tell them about the future? What do you tell them, and how do you get them ready for the future?
They've just got to be full of imagination. They've got to be filled with love, respect for others. I mean, that is, the other critical thing. We've talked a lot about environment and energy, but one of the biggest challenges we have in the world is a deficit of love and respect. There are many parts of the world where people of different backgrounds, races, religions, etc., used to live together amicably, but they cannot do so today. So in many parts of the world, we're becoming less tolerant and less respectful. And that's something, this is why I've been very critical of the way in which the media has operated in Western democracies in recent times, exacerbating divisions and hatreds and animosities. And I mean, you guys saw that in America on the 6th of January. That's where that ends, So mutual respect and recognizing our solidarity as citizens of a nation and as citizens of the world is critical.
Well, Malcolm, it's been a pleasure having you on the book again. I love it. A bigger picture. I look forward to meeting you in person when I come to Australia after COVID. And we still have a lot of questions to dive, because this is an 800-page book. So we'll have a lot to cover. But really, thank you for joining us here at EEI International Programs Global Electrification Forum. Wish you all the best and hope to see you soon.
Thanks a lot, Lawrence. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you again, Honorable Turnbull and Lawrence. I really appreciated your candid conversation on climate change and how we can move forward with meaningful action.